everyone. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you about my specific process of how I go about immersing a creative world into a game user interface. My name is Steph Chow. I am a UX UI consultant for games, and I'm really excited to be here. My first GDC was back in 2014, and it was such a great experience to attend these sessions. And the fact that I'm standing here giving my own talk is truly unbelievable. So I really hope you folks get something good out of it today. To give a short background of myself, before entering the game industry, I worked in the field of graphic design, primarily with branding, consumer products, and for entertainment. I then joined the game industry back in 2012 with Disney Games to help out with art direction and UI UX. And even after my time at Disney, I was able to work on other big brands with my consulting work for both new and live games. And so I've had the opportunity to work with really terrific brands that revolve around unique worlds. And for today, I have a couple goals I hope I can achieve with you. I hope that at the end of this talk, you will have a knowledge of the impact UI can have on your game's overall branding. You will have learned a method of how to go about producing creative UI elements that complements your game's world. And last but not least, an understanding of the balancing act required between your narrative UI and usability. So with my history embedded in working with art direction and UI and UX for games, I learned a lot of what it means to work on games backed by great IP. And as I worked on these games, I grew to realize that one of the reasons why players play these games is not just because the game is fun itself, but it's because of the worlds these IPs stem from, that fans grow to love for years, and sometimes even their entire life. And when I say worlds, I mean the fictitious universe created from mediums like film, games, and have their own individual culture, visual rules, and aesthetics. These worlds are the things people fall in love with because of the unique perspective they present that isn't of our world. And when it comes to games, the entire screen is an opportunity to help immerse a player in that world. So within a world, there are so many different visuals that one can take reference from when developing their game and their user interface. It's with the details that go beyond character art and environments, like typography, iconography, color palettes, that help keep a player immersed and engaged in a game. And in my years of working on interface, really what I've aimed for with art direction for UI UX is a branded experience. Creative worlds presented in games can make for a game's holistic brand vision and journey. And that's what you can achieve within a game's world and experience. A truly creative and exciting experience that through visuals, but also through functionality. While we often talk about user experience via functionality, this player experience, along with world immersion, becomes defining of a great brand experience. Take, for example, BioShock Infinite game by Irrational Games. Yes, the game is a first-person shooter set in the early 1900s, but while you're not shooting up enemies or engaging in psychokinetic powers, you're still able to be immersed within the world while navigating crucial UI that enables the game to be played by the player in the first place. And that brings me to an important point. Just as important for a game to be visually immersive, games as interactive experiences need to be usable and easy to use. We want as little friction to happen so the player can enjoy the game's world because it plays into the bigger picture of defining a great brand experience. A pretty game is nothing with a bad user experience. So it's imperative that you focus on creating a UI that is simultaneously usable and immersive. Even with the Dead Space series by EA, the team successfully created a diegetic user interface that had yourself and the main character immersed in the same world and seeing the same UI. There is still, though, a simultaneous focus, however, on how everything is laid out and designed that enables the player to frictionlessly navigate the game's content. So when we talk about immersive elements with your game, which equals out to the entire user experience, UI has the same capability to immerse a player into a world, just like characters, visual effects, and environments. UI is an opportunity to reflect your game's world and strengthen your game's visual branding through narrative, graphics, and of course, usability. So in a compact amount of time, I will discuss how to embed a game's world in its UI via these three phases: research, exploration, and iteration. So step one, let's create the foundation, power up and research your world. What is the world you are presenting to the player? What is the world influenced by culturally? What visuals, patterns, textures can you take on with your UI? This is a time to seek out the visual elements that make your world distinct. And it's quite possible that the same references your game's world is inspired by can be the same references that your UI can be inspired by. But there's so many different places your UI can get inspiration from. UI can be inspired by history, most notably how the Bethesda's Fallout series took inspiration from American 1950s post-war signage and technology interfaces. The Fallout series has a remarkably branded image through its UI. Typography, color, textures, all of it plays a part of keeping your universe immersed into the game. The UI evokes a powerful brand, while the player enacts with content in a way that allows them a fun experience. UI can even be inspired by nature, as seen here in King's Paradise Bay. You can see how the button's color palette and treatment is reminiscent of oceans and natural rocks. UI can even be inspired by, say, a subculture, where it's very clear how games like Nintendo's Splatoon 2 gets an inspiration from punk and urban references. While this universe is out of this world, their UI draws actually from very familiar, fun color palettes that you will see often in graffiti and other fashionable punk patterns. So big picture, UI doesn't have to just be a bright, juicy green button. There are plenty of ways to dress it up, so in a natural way that fits with your game's narrative if you desire it. Now, all those games that I showed were already live, and for example of myself with this process, when I was working on Moana's Island Life, I had spent hours researching myself in the Oceania culture, which is what the movie itself is based off of. And when you're researching, you start to not only find keywords that define your world, but you start seeing inspiration for your UI. You start to see how icons can be designed, how silhouettes can be used, or what even kind of color palettes or typography you can dot to these 3 keywords. And that is going to allow you to start researching a handful of fonts that can complement your world, start developing a UI color palette that guides the user naturally while still maintaining a branded experience, or even provide inspiration of what kind of pop-up container shapes you can house your UI content in. So after researching your world, picking up visual cues and palettes, you can then take this all into exploration for a couple of sample screens. And by doing so, you can see what portions of your research is going to work and maybe not work so well. My suggestion would be to apply this exploration with something like perhaps a main game HUD, a character screen. So to recap, within research that acts as your foundation for your UI immersion, I would recommend looking into reference visuals and their details that inspire your game's world. If you can do that beyond Google by, say, watching movies, museum visits that are similar to the world that has inspired your game, that makes for even better reference. And finally, once you have all this research, you can then start taking it to the exploration phase. So then when we go into the exploration phase, this is our chance to build out our UI on perhaps a couple of key screens, and we want to answer the question of how do you immerse the world into your UI? And it's exciting because all you have to do is just explore. I think this is a great opportunity to be able to explore all different kinds of spectrums of visuals when you're setting out for your UI direction. To me, it's almost like let's say, baking a cake. There's so many different ingredients to play with that not only influences the way that your cake tastes, but also how it looks. There's an endless amount of variations that you can proceed with, but this is a time with the range of UI elements for your game that you can think about how your player will enjoy the most. But what's important is that you explore the spectrum offered by your ingredients. These UI ingredients can allow for immersion, but within each one, there are different spectrums you can experiment with during your exploration. For example, diegetic UI or non-diegetic UI. Which one will work better for your game? And as a quick recap, diegetic UI is interface that is included in the game's world. For example, it can be seen and heard by the game characters. Non-diegetic, however, is interface that is rendered outside the game world, only visible and audible to the players in the real world. So with diegetic, you are able to gain a fully immersive narrative visually. It's great when the narrative is very natural, like, let's say, looking at a map the same way that Campo Santo's Firewatch does, or even in Dead Space, because you and your character are in a spaceship, ultimately, you're looking at the same heads-up display. But there's also risk to diegetic UI. If you have a lot of information to show, there's a chance that crucial information can get buried due to the narrative UI. Complex tasks in the game may have a lot of friction due to a heavy cognitive load required by these tasks. And when you commit to diegetic look, you're committing to preserving the fourth wall, which could prove later difficult depending on your player's task in the game. And non-diegetic shouldn't be considered a loss of narrative, as it's there to help guide the player through complex tasks and strategies. And as you see with even games such as Riot's League of Legends or Atlas's Persona series, the two keep to non-diegetic because they have complex tasks and content that should be clearly separated so the player can easily play the game. But of course, the risk of non-diegetic is depending on how it is laid out and designed, because the way, if it's badly laid out, you can risk further complicating your complex task. And if it's not designed correctly, then it will distract from the world being presented, in addition to just breaking the fourth wall. So how do you explore the decision to have a UI that is more diegetic or non-diegetic? Well, it depends. Both can be narrative. This should be more of a decision based on your game's mediums and mechanics. For simple mechanics or console games, you may not need a non-diegetic UI and can project through characters or other diegetic methods. But perhaps your game is significantly complex with strategy that creating that UI layer in between the player will make for a frictionless experience between a player and a game's world. So depending on how you pursue via diegetic or non-diegetic UI, there are still several other ingredients you can play with that immerse your world into the UI. Skeuomorphic UI creates a sense of familiarity by emulating materials, while flat design stays true to its medium, often feeling minimal and utilitarian. But for Blizzard's Hearthstone, the developer commits to a skeuomorphic UI that enforces their narrative for a player literally playing with cards in this tavern that's in the game. The game is a card game, yet through its UI elements, we are kept in a world that preserves such a narrative that feels tangible to the user. And while flat design stays true to its minimal style, it can help focus the player on what the bigger focus of the world is in the game. For example, Nintendo's Pokemon Go solely wants to focus on the Pokemon, so they aim to keep their UI rather minimal and flat in order to focus consistently on the Pokemon. And then you have things like, or games like Nintendo's Zelda Breath of the Wild, where the minimal flat design allows the player to focus on Link, to focus on his inventory, which plays a huge part of the adventurous world within the game. And while these few examples are extremities, you often see many games will adopt almost a mixture, but they do so in a way that tries to complement the world in a consistent manner and to not look fractured within their UI. So when going through your exploration, even testing out designs through a similar visual scale can help you create a wide variety of choices. While I tend to do this specific exercise just with one layout, even different layouts are worth exploring as well when looking at the visual scale of each design. Layout as well has the ability to promote easy usability and world immersion. Within Nintendo's Fire Emblem Heroes, the way they lay out their gacha feature plays in line with their narrative of using magical stones to summon heroes through a mystical gateway. The layout of the orbs is not only easy to interact with by simply tapping, but they're also able to clearly explain the benefits of each orb and what kind of hero you can gain while summoning the stone's hero. Another fun example is with Dragon Ball Z Dokkan Battle. When you're about to go into battle, not only is the screen laid out in this exciting, action-packed, manga-inspired layout, but it also clearly communicates who you are fighting against. Or even the way that they decide to display their characters, that even though it's just about communicating basic stats, they do so in mimicking a traditional trading card layout style, which is very familiar to the brand's long history of selling trading cards. And then if we even go beyond just static visuals, but animation of your UI can still keep the player immersed within the world. Here in Quantic Dream's Heavy Rain, the developers clearly develop an animation UI that helps communicate timing urgency of specific commands that were pinned to their related actions, such as punching and dodging. And even with EA's Mirror's Edge, the team was able to use animation with their UI to not only direct the player in the right direction, but simultaneously promote the game's spirit of being a fast-paced action game. So in short, there is so much you can explore in these phases with just using these 4 UI elements when you're trying to figure out how to immerse a game's world into the UI. Just know that variety is king in this phase, and exploring different varieties of each ingredient will provide for a wholesome building process. But then once you build out these UI options, how do you pick? In the iteration phase, you get to decide the balance between narrative UI and its impact on the overall user experience. You've done a bunch of exploration of what your UI can be, but in the end of the day, we need to remember that UI needs to enable interaction with the game's world, not distract from it. Sometimes this decision can be very clear, but I have found that focusing on these 4 main elements often help me edit, revise, and decide a solid direction when it comes to critical UI visuals for a game. Readability. Am I sacrificing readability for style? Am I looking at the game's info or the info's styling? Consider the risk you could be over-designing your UI, perhaps due to color or more visual iteration in a decoration. You could be distracting the player from the content you're presenting to them. Personality. Can I see my world's keywords when I look at the UI, even without the visual support of characters and environments? What's important to see is in those games' brands or keywords are visually implied in the design. So visuals have the ability to stand on their own, but still reflect the game's brand. Implication. Are interactive elements distinct from non-interactive elements? How much can I edit down to a more essential core look? Your UI doesn't have to be literal to your references. Perhaps color palettes and light iconography is enough to communicate a brand in a world. Also, I need to make sure that the player can tell the difference between interactive objects and non-interactive objects. And finally, scale. Does the visual UI language have legs to expand to other UI elements? Can I scale without breaking the memory bank within the game? Can I possibly scale this distinct look to even perhaps marketing or community assets? You may find that perhaps some of your ideas, while looking really cool, have a really heavy memory load, or can't even scale, let's say, from a 9-slicing perspective. So when you look and start to iterate your designs, you just need to be judicious about these 4 categories. You need a balance between narrative impact and player usability. Remember, during our process, how good UI should enhance and promote a frictionless experience for a player and the world they are interacting with. UI is just one of the many visual elements that can be included in your game to enhance the game's world, and once you have chosen a UI direction, likely you'll need to keep iterating on it too. And when that happens, it's always good to keep some key principles in mind to make sure your UI's narrative isn't jeopardizing usability. As I am creating UI for an entirely new game, I will always refer to these 10 usability heuristics provided by the Nielsen-Norman Group to help me revise my immersive UI. And even though a lot of the examples I had were very much console or mobile-based, I just wanted to give some thoughts on as well of how I can see UI immersion continuing on with some new mediums within games. So for AR and UI immersion, I think that there's going to be a very interesting balancing act. Since AR's focus with games will be based on the camera and real-world interactions, I feel like the user interface will be kept to a minimal to balance out with the camera visuals, especially if the intent is to blend a player's environment with game visuals, such as characters. A focus on that experience would require minimal interface on your screen. And when it comes to VR, I think that there's a huge opportunity for diegetic UI. With VR, the additional access to haptic audio and animation features that provides good player feedback mechanisms can also be considered for world immersion opportunities. And you'll also likely need to still have some kind of visual interface like type or perhaps even buttons for accessibility. But there's going to be some really exciting stuff that goes on, I think, between VR and immersion for UI. So to conclude, it's really crucial during the entire process that you keep a very open mind of how you can inject story into your UI. There are visual ways, both diegetic and non-diegetic, to do so. And by doing so, you're going to keep a player immersed in a game's world, which will be beneficial to your overall brand. It is just your job as a UI UX designer to make sure that this UI does not distract from the world. And you can do that using heuristic principles. And this is just even more important because we live in a time, in a market where not investing in your UI's ability to add on to your brand, to pass up on that opportunity is a mistake. There are so many user interfaces that are generic and can be mistaken for any other, let's say, sci-fi game, or even any other farm building game. Your UI is an opportunity to be as unique as your game's world, so take advantage of it. So if you only take a smidgen away from today's presentation, here's a few things to remember. To acquire a well-designed immersive UI, split your process into research, exploration, and iteration. And then during your exploration, make sure to test a design out with a variety of designs, a variety of layouts. Think about how animation can play a part in your UI. And then finally, when you want to decide that balance between your UI's immersion and usability, you can use these 4 elements to iterate and improve your UI. So that's it for me. Thank you everyone for listening, and hopefully I can take some questions.
First of all, thank you very much for delivering this incredible speech. Now, with regards to diegetic and non-diegetic UI, I know that there are games that do it fully on one end or the other, and then there are games like the Metro series that kind of have a balance between that in terms of stealth and objectives for in-game objects and things like ammo counts, for instance, being non-diegetic. Do you think that there's a risk of a conflict between immersion, readability, and all those aspects that you mentioned when you try to strike a middle ground?
So your question is there a risk in going for a more diegetic UI and risking usability for immersion's sake?
Basically, if immersion is going to be impacted somewhat if you try to go in the middle, if you try to incorporate components from both ends?
I would say if you try and strike a balance that's in between those two, you have to do so in a consistent manner. And depending on the user task, whether it's something that's really complex, the more complex a task is, diegetic UI may not be, diegetic UI is useful when it feels very first nature to the player. And so if it's a very complicated task that a user doesn't, say, experience in the real world, it will be tough. But you should always explore if you can.
Of course. Thank you kindly.
Thank you.
Hi, Steph. I'm Kevin. I'm a UX designer at Google Maps, and I love what I do, but I'm really torn when it comes to in-game navigation UI. And one of the things I've always found conflicting was reaching your destination or seeing in an abstract, simplistic 2D view of your goals or enemies on the map, and sometimes that would break immersion. And sometimes I would actually play games very differently, turning off the UI entirely. Games like Far Cry, Assassin's Creed Syndicate. My first experience turning off UI was the radar in Metal Gear Solid 2, and it completely blew my mind. I was curious as to if you have any insights, the balance between reaching your goal and objectives versus immersion in nav UI.
Right. So in regards to, you said Google Maps.
Yeah.
So for Google Maps, I would just turn to the user for your answer. Why is your user using Google Maps? It's because they're trying to get somewhere. They're not necessarily looking for an immersive experience, like let's say with games. And so I think if being able to optimize for that process for them, the experience will be much better if it's more clear to them, just like, I just want to get from point A to point B. But then it's always thinking about, I guess you would say, the user's intent of why they're doing that task.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi. So you mentioned a few times about animated UI elements. I was just wondering if you had any specific methods or tools for kind of communicating the intended animation to developers or clients when you're kind of exploring?
Right, yeah. I mean, it really depends on your resources at that point. Sometimes, depending on your games team, you have people who are naturally animators. Sometimes you have only resources, let's say, like PowerPoint, right? And I say that it really depends on your comfort level. Sometimes even for myself, I will just use like a quick keynote depending on the animation, just to demonstrate, okay, this UI element should move over here once I acquire this goal. So I would say it really depends on your resources. Yeah.
Thanks.
Do you recommend any practices or pieces of work that new UX designers should try and add to their portfolio if they're just trying to get into the industry?
Right. I would say that's an interesting question. And I would say from that perspective, I think the best thing you can do as a UI designer starting out is just to create your own projects, and to do so in a way that I think what's always a lovely demonstration is when you show something like a game HUD and a character profile screen, because that demonstrates your skill of layout, your skill of colors and typography, and you want to be able to tell them that you can balance in between screens that have a lot of information that needs to be digested versus very minimal information.
Thank you.
So does localization ever play a factor? I know in my personal experience, I have artists pick great fonts that fit the world and they don't have any European characters, so we can't localize. And maybe on the flip side, you need to do something like an IKEA manual that there's no text at all, but that might fit the world.
That's a really good question. So in terms of localization, I think from an exploration perspective, you should be, when you're creating these UI screens, it should be very inspirational. And so from that perspective, you should try and find fonts that feel true to your brand, but then afterwards, you can take that as kind of your goal, and then look at fonts that are able to be like localized for your game. And so I would say for your research and exploration part, you just look at what you feel like is the best font, and then after that, you go into localization fonts and see, and then work with your font vendor to see which font will match closest to it.
Do you have any ideas or guidelines or recommendations for, say, user interfaces and user experience in games or immersive environments where there isn't necessarily a fourth wall, where instead of playing a character, you are more or less the character in something that is like either slightly augmented reality or an alternate reality that is still making callbacks to the current reality? Like, a lot of what I like to do is in those situation environments where there's a little bit of a blur between game reality and reality, so UX and UI there for me gets a little confusing because I'm not quite sure what to do because there's not really a fourth wall, and the only information presented to you is entirely separate and also the same as the character as you are the character.
Right. So in that respect, I would say that it depends on your game's nature, right? If it's a very story-driven game, then I think that you want to not necessarily, like UI is important, but then you want to make sure it's not distracting as well from the main experience. So especially if you're doing something like mixed reality, augmented reality, I would say that you want, if anything, you want user interface at that point to be very minimal. In terms of resources, I would say just being able to, really being able to, I think like research about just like any other games that have been working on it, just seeing their findings as well would be a good idea. Because especially with AR, like there's going to be new usability issues that you're going to be finding yourself. So it's a little process, I think.
Thank you.
And I think actually we're out of time right now, and so I'll be just on the side if you have more questions. And thank you so much for listening.